Welcome to the Birth Lounge Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts and learn how to craft your ideal birth. Hey, y'all, welcome back to another episode of the Birth Lounge Podcast. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest that I'm super excited to talk about and a topic that I'm so passionate about. I'm so excited to have Dr. Rixa Freeze with me today. She is a research professor and also the president of Breech Without Borders. Dr. Rixa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
What are the basics that we need to know when we are talking about breech birth?
Yeah. Well, I'll start really basic and explain what it is. Most people who are listening to your podcast probably know, but in case they don't, it's when the baby comes out butt or knees or feet first rather than head first. And it's about 3 to 4% at term. So there's some genetic component to it. Breech tends to run in families. There's some component due to uterine shapes, like a bicornuate or unicornuate uterus. But honestly, most of the time, we still don't know why some babies choose to remain breech.
If you had a breech birth before, are you more likely to have a breech baby with subsequent pregnancies?
It's not a guarantee. I mean, if you've had a breech baby once, I think it's something like a 10% recurring chance that your next one will be, which is more than the average, but not a guarantee. But certainly the more you have, then the more likely the next one will be.
Sure. And how do we treat breech births differently? So what kind of conversation should we be having with our providers if we find that our baby is breech and we're interested in having a breech delivery?
The big difference nowadays is that the vast majority of providers are not adequately trained and are not adequately experienced, and thus not confident in their ability to safely attend a vaginal breech birth. In a setting with providers who are well trained and comfortable doing it, the conversation doesn't necessarily need to be a lot different. There's a small subset of risks that are a little bit different for breech babies rather than head down babies. Some of it's due to the mode of birth, whether you have a C-section or vaginal birth. And some of the risk is just due to having a breech baby. There's a little bit of unique risks that come with a baby who's lying breech. Doesn't matter which way it's born. So really the big conversation in a United States setting and in a setting in many places around the world, frankly, is can I even find somebody who knows what they're doing to attend me? And if you're in the situation where you find out at 35, 36, 37 weeks, 39 weeks that your baby's breech, you're going to find out very quickly that there's probably nobody to help you out. Or if there is somebody, you have to search far and wide and maybe call 30 different providers and maybe drive a couple hours across state lines in order to have a vaginal birth. All of a sudden, there's not a single person who can take care of them, short of just doing a surgery that they don't want and they probably don't need.
Talk to us about the safety of breech birth, because this is what I find, and I think my team would agree, that we find is the most problematic conversation. Providers are really scared of breech births, and so then they use fear-based language, and it kind of breeds fear into the person who has the breech baby.
Most providers who are educated today have an impression that breech birth is extremely dangerous, that it's almost a guarantee that your baby will die if you have a vaginal birth, that the danger is so high that even considering it is not reasonable at all. And that's typically the conversation that happens. It gets shut down very quickly. When in fact, when you actually look at the research, the risk of a breech birth is very, very small. And so I'm going to talk you through some of the numbers quite briefly. Now, the first thing to consider too is when we talk about risk, we have to ask risk to whom. So there's 5 main categories we have to think about: short and long term for the mother, short and long term for the baby, and then also risks to the next child. So let's talk first off short-term risk to the baby, because that's the one that everybody tends to focus on, and in particular, the risk of perinatal mortality, the risk of the baby dying during labor or in the first 28 days after the birth. So, if you're comparing your baseline C-section at 39 weeks versus a head down planned vaginal birth, it's 1 in 1,000 versus 1 in 2,000. And that risk most people accept without blinking an eye, really. How does breech come into that picture? What we find looking at the best nationwide data is that a planned vaginal breech birth in a first world industrialized nation context adds about another risk of 1 in 1,000 chance of perinatal mortality. Okay. So for an overall risk, if you add the risk of the vaginal birth, itself, not the breech part, but just the vaginal part, being pregnant and having a vaginal birth, that's about 1 in 1,000. And then the breech adds another 1 in 1,000 for a combined risk of about 2 in 1,000. What we find is that in countries where obstetricians and midwives never lost the skill of breech and where it's done regularly and where everybody's taught the skills, the data on those outcomes are as good as a planned C-section at 39 weeks. So what we can say with a good amount of confidence is that if you come from a background where you're skilled and experienced and where the people around you are skilled and experienced, that it looks like the risk of perinatal mortality can be eliminated entirely. And it's just as good as a planned C-section at 39 weeks. In other words, there's no benefit to routinely planning a C-section. We have made breech birth more dangerous by not doing it. So let's move on to the mother, maternal outcomes. So we have short and long term. Short term is kind of during the period of the hospital stay, immediate postpartum. Unequivocally, vaginal birth is safer for the mother, both in the short term and in the long term. And this includes the risk of dying. This includes the risk of having placenta accreta or percreta. This includes the risk of uterine rupture if you have a C-section and then you have a VBAC. No matter how the next baby is born, your baby has a higher risk of dying if you had a C-section the first time. And this is important if a woman is not absolutely sure that she's done having children when she has this breech baby, whether it's a first or a middle baby. If she thinks there's any chance she's going to have more, then the conversation should be, let's do everything we can to make this birth vaginal because it's so much safer for you. And then moving on to the last thing that we want to talk about is what happens for future babies and future pregnancies. And unequivocally, it is a lot safer for all the mother's future babies if her breech baby is born vaginally.
Sure. So what do we know about breech birth in the hospital versus home birth? Anything?
It's really hard to compare the home versus hospital because of the relative dearth of information that we have on home breech outcomes. I would love for breech birth to be widely available in hospitals. Not that I want it to be banned from home, but I think that the 99% of women who are birthing in hospitals still deserve to have that option. Because to be honest, if you want a vaginal breech birth right now in almost any city in the United States, you have to go to a home birth provider because the hospital people aren't doing it, which is totally insane. But it's the home birth midwives that right now are showing up. If you're a provider who's hospital-based and listening to this, first of all, thank you, because I know it's kind of a taboo topic and, on par with, eating babies for dinner, probably. Maybe you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable and that's probably a good thing. Maybe that means that you need to up your game a little bit, take some risks. Don't force women to take risks because you're too scared. You've been educated in a culture of fear. But why not? Why not at least learn the skills? And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by how beautiful a process breech birth can be and how it makes so much sense once you understand what it looks like and how it works, and you understand the mechanics and how this baby navigates its way through the pelvis. And I really think that if you take our training, not to say that we're the only one, but I think we're the only major organization in the US right now that's training, I think you'll be honestly quite surprised by how fun it is to learn and how fascinating it is.
Yeah, I think that as providers, and I harp on this all the time, it is your job to offer your patients, your clients, the spectrum of care, whether you agree with that care or not. So whether you would choose breech birth for yourself or not, if you have agreed to be an obstetrician or a midwife that attends labors, then you have agreed to support this person in whatever they have chosen. And if you can't fulfill that, then at the end of the day, you're actually not meeting your job requirement. You should be able to offer the entire spectrum. It doesn't have to be your specialty. And I would expect that some obstetricians would be specialized in breech and VBAC and twins. But every provider out there, in my opinion, if I ran the US medical system, would have to have experience and knowledge and training in the otherwise normal variations of birth. Okay, so circling us back to what we can expect from the breech birth experience, are we looking at a longer labor? Are we looking at longer push time?
I think that the big difference is that because breech births, as the baby's born past about the umbilicus, give or take, usually there often can be some cord compression in advance of the head being born. Not always, but you kind of expect that the last few moments of birth, there's going to be some cord compression. And I think the one concern would be that if the baby has already lost a lot of its reserves during labor and is already struggling in advance of the expulsion stage, it might be harder for that baby to tolerate that compression, cord compression and restriction of oxygenation at the very end if it's already been depleting its reserve and having a long, a struggle beforehand. So that would probably be clinically the only thing that would be more concerning. Now, this is kind of a general observation. It's not true for everybody, but you might feel a little different, and it might not quite feel as much like you have this great big bowling ball coming out. It might feel a little differently because it's not quite as hard. Some people say it feels about the same though, so it can vary, but that's one thing that you might be prepared for, something that feels a little bit different as it's rumping, as the baby's actually emerging through your perineum.
Okay, so my very last question is, let's start off with the very bold statement that just because you have a breech baby, you don't have to have a C-section. Obviously, that's what we've talked about this whole time. So let's wrap up with two things. If we have a breech baby, is there a better position, or are there better labor and birth positions than others? Obviously upright, but are there any positions that stand out?
Upright birth positions, so kneeling or standing or all fours, hands and knees, is better in terms of maternal outcomes, fewer maternal injuries. It's better in terms of neonatal outcomes. So the babies get stuck a lot less often when mom is upright versus on her back. You just need an environment where you're free to really just move and dance and get that baby out. And if you're left to your own devices in a supportive environment, you're going to find what feels best, and you'll naturally do those things that help the baby come out.
And a lot of that comes with safety. So if you're with a provider who does not feel safe and secure in their own skills of supporting a breech birth, you too are not going to feel safe with their care, because you're going to pick up on their own fear. Their fear will transfer to you. I've seen it a million times. All right, Dr. Rixa, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And to everyone out there, I hope that you check us out on Instagram, visit us on YouTube, or listen to the podcast. We will link all of the things that you need to get a hold of and look into all of the resources that we have from Dr. Rixa today. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.